Hello and welcome to another exciting edition of Biblical Exegesis Practicum online with Life Pacific University. Today we're going to be talking about the New Testament's use of the Old Testament, and this is a fascinating discussion which we could do an entire class just on New Testament's use of the Old Testament, and in fact I actually did an entire class in my graduate studies on this, and the paper that you're actually going to be reading next week of mine on 1 Timothy 2 was my final paper from that class, which I then went on to get published. So this is an interesting topic, and we could spend a lot of time on this, but for our purposes, and 200 level class, I want to focus on just kind of the basics here. And one of the central debates here, if you pick up the Zondervan Three Views on the New Testament's use of the Old Testament, one of the main debates there is whether or not the New Testament authors are using the Old Testament passage in the same sense as the author of the Old Testament. Now, I'm going to let you make up your mind on what you think about that. You may have some commitments there regarding what you think the New Testament authors are doing. At the very least, whether they're using it in the same sense or not, we have to at least say that they're doing some creative things with the text. Probably the easiest example of this creative exegesis, we might call it, is the way that Paul, assuming that you take Paul to be the author of Ephesians, which I do, but not everybody does, the way that Paul in Ephesians chapter 4 employs Psalm 68. In Psalm 68, it says that there's someone who ascends on high, leading captivity captive and receiving gifts from men. And then when Paul quotes that, he says that the person has ascended on high, led captivity captive, and has given gifts to men. What I think is happening in that passage, to give you an example of the New Testament's use of the Old Testament, there's a change. I mean, Paul is not quoting it exactly the way that it shows up in the Old Testament. But I think the reason that he changes it is because there's a change in redemptive history. What the psalm is saying is that the messianic ruler, the Davidic king, will be victorious over the enemies, and those are the captives that he's leading captive, and those are the people that he's receiving as gifts, that they're the captives that are coming to him. And the psalm explicitly says, even from rebellious humanity. So the rebellious humans are the ones that are being given to him. They're sort of like the spoils of war, right? The defeated foe that he's receiving as his prize for winning the battle. Well, I think there's a turn there from what the psalmist is saying that is going to happen, and then what Paul says happens after that. So Paul is kind of shifting it from the psalmist saying Jesus is going to receive gifts from men, and Paul's saying, what is he going to do with those gifts? Well, he's going to give those gifts back to men. And if you think about this in redemptive history, I mean, this is precisely what he does. He takes rebellious humans, receives them, reforms them, redeems them, and then sends them back out. And that's exactly what Paul's getting at in Ephesians chapter 4, is that, he gave some to be apostles, prophets, evangelists, teachers, and pastors for the equipping of the saints for the work of the ministry until we attain the fullness of Christ, right? So that gift of those apostles, prophets, evangelists, teachers, pastors, they're given back to humanity to fix humanity so that humanity can then be sent out again also to do ministry. And so it's sort of that perpetual cycle of he receives the gift, he repairs the gift, and then he sends the gift back out to gather more gifts, right? He receives humanity, even rebellious humanity, according to the psalm, receives even rebellious humanity, and redeems rebellious humanity, and then sends that redeemed humanity back out as missionaries into the world to gather more rebellious humanity back to him so that you can have that perpetual cycle. And so this is a passage where if you just read it at first blush, it is going to look a little bit odd, but I think if we do the work and we think through what's happening in the text, I think we do see that Paul has in mind what the passage is saying in the Old Testament, but then also is sort of doing some unique things, right? And so this is what we want to think about when we're working with a passage that has some kind of echo to the Old Testament. Now, both of our New Testament passages in this course have echoes in the Old Testament. Now, there's debate as to whether or not Luke 15 does. There's some debate there, but I think it does. And my point here, I think, to kind of help tease this out for you, again, like with other stuff that we've done in this class, if we were sitting in class together, I would work with you to try to tease this out, and we'd get there together. But for our purposes in this online class, when you're reading Luke 15, you do your passage-level observations, you carefully read through the passage. You see that you have Pharisees and scribes. You have Pharisees and scribes who are not happy with the way that Jesus is interacting with these sinners, right, is the word that gets used there. And Jesus, in response to how they see these people, he tells parables. He tells these 3 parables. And when we read these 3 parables together, we should read them together, because there are things that are being they're helping us interpret each other, right? We have lost sheep, lost coin, and we might call lost son, right? So we have 3 things that have been lost. Lost sheep, you're going to go out and you're going to try to find the sheep, and then you find the sheep, and then you rejoice. Lost coin, you're going to try to find the coin, and when you find it, you're going to rejoice. Well, what you sort of expect based on that pattern, and again, this is a narrative, and remember, narrative has repetition and interruption. And so what you expect based on that repetition, based on that pattern, is that with the son, you're going to have a lost son, you're going to go find the son, and then you're going to rejoice. And that's basically all that's going to happen. But there's more to it than that. Jesus tells this story, and he says that there are 2 sons of a man, and one of them wants their inheritance early. Now, what does that sound like? If you're thinking carefully about the Old Testament, which all of Jesus's audience would have, especially with regard to Jacob, who is later the namesake for the people of Israel. Jacob's name changes to Israel. If you're thinking carefully about that story, Jacob and Esau are 2 brothers where there's an inheritance issue. And then there's a conflict between those 2 brothers. And one of the brothers leaves and goes to a different country and then returns. I mean, this is prodigal son, right? This is very, very similar to the prodigal son. Now, you might say, there's a difference, though, because there's the father, right? When Jacob comes back, the father's not there, right? It's just Jacob and Esau. Well, I think that's part of the point. What Jesus is doing here, in my estimation, and you can disagree with me if you want, but just to kind of give you some things to think about as you're working on this message, what I think Jesus is doing here is he's taking the Jacob and Esau paradigm, which they would have been very familiar with, right? That there's a dispute about inheritance between 2 brothers, and they go to their father to resolve the dispute. Sounds very much like Jacob and Esau. But the people that he's aiming this parable at, those people have missed the point of the Jacob and Esau narrative. And so Jesus has to change the Jacob and Esau narrative. Now, this isn't to say that Jesus is trying to say something else happened to Jacob and Esau, right? No, he's retelling the narrative. He's telling a story here, intentionally making it sound like Jacob and Esau, but making some changes to it to illustrate a point. And so what point is he trying to illustrate? Well, what's the main difference between Luke 15, apart from the father, between Luke 15 and the Jacob and Esau narrative? Well, in the Jacob and Esau narrative, Esau receives Jacob back. So the elder brother, who is upset with the younger brother, receives the younger brother back. What do we get in Luke 15? The elder brother does not receive the younger brother back. And so what I think Jesus is doing here is he needs to illustrate that the elder brother is not acting appropriately, and so he needs the father in there to show here's how it should be done, and here's how the elder brother is acting in spite of the fact that that's not how he should act, right? And ultimately the point here then is that Esau and Jacob is the patriarch for the Israelites, and he is received by Esau. The people who are in the beginning of Luke 15 criticizing Jesus for spending time with sinners, all of those sinners, so to speak, are descendants of Jacob. And the people who are criticizing Jesus are descendants of Jacob. And Jesus is saying here, if you have a descendant of Jacob, and that descendant of Jacob were to get lost, and that descendant of Jacob were to come back, how would you respond? Because Esau, in the Jacob and Esau narrative, responds by embracing Jacob. But the people in Jesus' audience aren't responding that way. They're not responding that way when these people who are sinners are coming back. That they're being embraced by Jesus. They're not responding that way. So Jesus has to kind of retell the story a little bit to try to show them, like, look, you're not even acting like Esau, let alone acting like Jacob, which would be heavily insulting to them, because if you know much about Israel's history, Esau leads to the Edomites. He's the father of the Edomites, whereas Jacob is the father of the Israelites. And the Israelites do not like the Edomites. In fact, if you look at the book of Amos talks about this and says that the Edomites have forgotten the covenant of brotherhood with the Israelites. And so that's a problem there, right? That historically they remember this brotherhood that exists between Israel and Edom. Well, Edom in the first century, Herod is an Edomite, and nobody in the first century is a big fan of Herod, right? And so what Jesus is essentially saying is your behavior, Pharisee, in not accepting this person is not even rising to the level of Esau. It's not even rising to the level of an Edomite. It's not even rising to the level of Herod. Not to mention even being an Israelite, right? Like, you're definitely not being an Israelite right now, because an Israelite would embrace the Jacob who is returning. That's what he would do. Now, I realize that's a little complicated. I hope that in explaining that, you can read the text again and kind of see how that might play out in the text. If, like I said, if we had more time to spend together, we could kind of read through this and see some of the echoes in there that might connect the two. And again, like I said, if you want to disagree with me on this, that's perfectly fine. I'm just trying to give you a picture into the New Testament's use of the Old Testament. It's similar to when we looked at Jonah and how Jonah used the Psalms, right? It's ultimately intertextuality, right? How one text is using another text. What are they doing? But especially, how does the New Testament use the Old Testament? That's what we're doing here. Next week, when we talk about 1 Timothy 2, we're going to be talking about this as well. We'll be talking about that in a little bit more detail next week, because it's incredibly important next week to understand the reference to the Old Testament. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. Later this week, we'll have another video talking about how to write the message. I know some of you struggled with writing the message, and that's perfectly fine. It's understandable. And so we'll have a video to talk about that, to say, here's kind of how you walk through writing a message of a passage, and hopefully that'll help you out with this, and then also with the message that you have to write next week. So until next time.